Today, I'm gonna be doing something that is a little different, yet somehow still sits in my usual vein of content. Since the focus of this video has probably been done to hell and back by this point, I thought I'd do an analysis that's a little different from my usual style of work, just so it sticks out a little bit more. Hachiman Hikigaya. He's a character that you've definitely heard about if you've spent any amount of time in the community talking about slice of life anime. He's a character that I've felt an affinity with for around 6 years now, ever since the first time I watched the first season of OreGairu back in 2014. If you've seen my Makaku City Actors video, you know that back during that time, I was in a really bad mental state. My mindset was very negative, and since I'd graduated from school relatively recently, it was the hardest I'd ever been on myself. I felt like an absolute failure because my life was stagnating and, no matter what I did, I'd always end up back at square one. When I was watching OreGairu back during this time, I had such a surface level relation to Hachiman. I pretty much only related to him because he was a loner, and I felt just as negative as a person. Ironically, while I was rewatching the series to prepare for its final season, I noticed that I had a lot more in common with him back then than I'd like to admit. Hachiman was an outcast among his peers, and to cope with this fact, he convinced himself that things were better this way. It caused this really awful mindset for him, where he'd always make himself out to be the sacrificial lamb if any problem arose involving him. In the back of his mind, Hachiman knew how bad this part of him was, but he never wanted to admit to it. Since he never had people outside of his family care about him, he'd more often than not default to that behavior since he found it was easier to just push everyone away. This part of his character was where I felt like I was staring at my younger self before she locked herself away. It was something that I started noticing in my original watch, but never fully realized it until my second time experiencing the series. Before that time, I had no idea how terribly Hachiman bottled up how he felt about things. With how he was so willing to just tell people about his horrible past experiences, you wouldn't really think that he was trying to hide how he truly felt about things. If you look past that part, you notice that Hachiman wears his heart on his sleeve, though it's not quite as noticeable until he realizes that he has people that care about him. Hachiman is also very observant and quite considerate of others, which doesn't really help the negative reputation he has around school. He'd notice when people were having trouble, but he wouldn't really help them unless they asked him to. If the time called for it, he'd bring up some of his most depressing and embarrassing moments just to give someone a moment of solace. I've admired how nice Hachiman always was with the people around him, even when they gave him legitimate reasons to be hateful towards them instead. Hachiman enjoyed things the way they are, even if people weren't the best to him, because he wouldn't have to worry about people being disingenuous. In his eyes, it was all for the better, especially if they were strangers to him, since he wouldn't have to face the complex emotions he feels throughout the series. Hachiman is a fairly optimistic guy, which is a bit ironic when he seems so pessimistic. He's always wanted people that were true to themselves when interacting with him. He didn't really care for the kind of relationship as long as it was a genuine connection. In his mind, he also wanted something that was honestly impossible to have, a relationship where no one gets hurt. That part of him was what completely won me over with this character, especially considering it contradicted his realist perspective on things. Even when everyone around him was caught up worrying about romance, he tried his best to keep everything under control, even though that was partially because of his own selfish reasons. By this time, he'd finally realized that he had others who cared about him, so he wanted to keep the relationship as it already was. He even went so far as to make his interpersonal relationships stagnate, just to make sure no one would get hurt because he started noticing the girls around him were in love. It was at this point in the series where I started noticing how harmful a lot of this was to his mental state, and this is where it started depressing me, though I wouldn't fully realize how bad it would affect me until very recently. The final season of the series is where it became increasingly difficult for me to keep up with the story, not because of how the story's events were turning, but because of how Hachiman was throughout most of this part. Romance parts aside, I saw a lot of my own flaws within his mannerisms, and it's really tough to handle when you end up paying attention to that. Throughout this part of the anime, I had a very different impression from Hachiman. His mental state was going through the ringer, people around him were confusing him, and things weren't really seeming to go all that well for him at all. It was a roller coaster of an experience, and all I really wanted to do was see Hachiman be happy, because he really deserved it at this point. I had attached myself to him quite a bit throughout this section of the story, because it felt like if he would make it through this alright, it would give me hope for my own situation. I know it might be dumb to get this attached over a fictional character, but Hachiman has always struck a personal chord of mine, though which one it touched has changed a bit over the years. Hachiman Hikigaya is a character that has taught me that, even when things get heavy, life might not turn out to be so bad. Just stay true to yourself and things should be fine as long as you don't betray your own feelings. It's a grossly optimistic sentiment, but it's something that's resonated with me since I was younger, and you can also see part of that sentiment reflected throughout the things that I love. Anyways, that's how I feel about Hachiman. It might not be something my usual viewers expect, but I do hope you enjoyed seeing my personal perspective on things. It wasn't as in-depth as I usually do since I didn't really want to spoil too much of the story with my analysis. I only wanted to talk about the parts of him that I related to and parts of him that I really admire. It's not very often that I feel like I can fully understand a character because I see a large part of myself within them, after all.